The story begins with the blue skies and a clear view. A long-haired guy appeared, and it was our protagonist. His name was Jiang Xiaobai, and he was transported from Earth to the cultivation world. He remembered that it had been 18 years since he got there and 18 years of being sick because he was accepted into an immortal sect called Sect and became a mineral servant with a bright and promising future through a stroke of luck. He stood up and watched people below him. The place was full of lights. He firmly believed that as long as he perseveres, he would obtain any immortal pale one day, and his sickness would be cured. When a certain day came, the protagonist was captured by a man who grabbed his collar and lifted him into the sky, making him hold the antagonist's hand. The guy who grabbed the protagonist's collar uttered that a newcomer, coughing out of the spiritual tones and medicinal pills he received from Elder Huang, would guarantee his safety in the spirit feeding ground in the future. Yang Cheng, the outer disciple, refines the first layer. As Yang Chen made a scene, everyone around them worried about the protagonist. He yelled about how Elder Huang gave them to him and questioned why he should return them. People around them were worried and seemed to know about Yang Cheng's doings because one of them stated that Yang Cheng was back again. He continued grabbing the collar of the protagonist, then asked why he should do that, and then smashed the ladder on the floor and said that he just trusted that swabs on the floor and he could easily kill him with a flip of his palm. Jiang Xiaobai coughs blood as he sits on the floor. At the same time, his hand uses his support and fittings that painstakingly climb the mountain to seek an appeal, all for the sake of curing his fatal illness on the mountain at the time if his grandfather Song did not sacrifice his life to protect the ladder. He then recalled his grandpa, who had been protecting him when a creature attacked them. His grandpa was holding a sword while he was in the same position seated and spurts blood while he used his hand to support his balance. The key moment, a female immortal did not save him. He was afraid he would have long died in the mountains. A white-haired lady appeared and beheaded the creature using her sword. He realized that he finally managed to enter a sect and had just received medicinal pills and spiritual stones, but he ended up getting threatened by that person. As he contemplated his situation, he could not accept that someone had threatened him. Yang Cheng suddenly stepped on his hand, and that made him scream because of the pain that he felt, and the weight of Yang Cheng put pressure on that pain. His scream made people worried about him, while the antagonist was satisfied. He pointed his finger and stated that Xiaobai should face his reality in the sect because only the strong would win. He also added that right then, the latter was nothing but a lowly servant in the sect spirit feeding ground, and no one would care about whether he lived or died. Besides, he told the latter not to give up the spiritual stones and medicinal pills that he had on that day but also to give them to the antagonist every month. He pinpointed the people around them and named them as servants who did all the rules. He gave the latter name Little Bai. A guy approached the latter and stated that the Little Bai should give them to him first because his cousins were their sect's direct disciples, and they could not often give them. Xiaobai was flustered about the guy's actions, and the guy continued stating that it was a thought for everyone, too. He grunted and felt something approaching. It was Yang Cheng who came as fast as he could, which made the latter agree to give the stones. Yang Cheng smiled with his red eyes, indicating satisfaction about what he heard, and stated that the latter at least knew his place. The antagonist stopped and lifted his foot as he stepped on Xiaobai's hand. It is clearer that the protagonist's hand was covered with dirt and bruises. Yang Cheng kneeled to the level of Xiaobai and said that being an obedient dog was more worth it than being a corpse. He commands the protagonist to give him the stones. Xiaobai used his head to hit Yang Cheng's chin and yelled that he would give him nothing. People around them were shocked. Their eyes grew bigger, their mouths shaped into O, and they thought about the protagonist messing up big time. Yang Cheng was thrown down on the stunt that the pulled protagonist did. He ran fast as he could, as Yang Cheng realized that Xiaobai dared to hit him. Bloods were seen coming out of his mouth, and later on, he commanded the servants to follow him and beat him to death. One of the servants was on the side of Little Bai and instructed Xiaobai to run. As he heard the servant, he ran as fast as he could and somehow managed to escape the place. However, Yang Chen can be seen as something white that was embraced onto his body, which made him run faster and closer to reach the protagonist. Xiaobai turned his head on his back when he realized that Yang Cheng was already close enough to him, and he thought he would get caught. As he kept running, Xiaobai was somewhat confused about the path that he was taking since there was a rock that had split and roots with a lot of thorns. He ignored it and still ran through. He thought about the path that made Yang Chen flustered and scared, stopping him from chasing the protagonist. As he stopped urgently, the servants on his back were panting and gasping for air, like their leader, and they were also scared about the path. Xiaobai kept running without knowing it was the forbidden zone. Yang Cheng and the servants, just watching the latter, continued running and said boss to Yang Cheng. Their leader said that Xiaobai chose to seek death by himself, and it wasn't their fault. He then commanded the servants that if Elder Huang asked to say that he ran by himself and if they didn't obey him, they should not think about living well. All the servants agreed on what Yang Cheng instructed them. On the other hand, in the middle of the forest, Xiaobai was seen resting on rocks that he was leaning on. He was gasping for air as he patted his chest. The latter has a red mark of blood that was flowing on his right shoulder. He searched for his medicine, ate it, and uttered that the medicinal pill was for his broken body, and it was the pill of his life. He also scoffed that giving the pill to them was the same as giving up his life. He continued to lead, indicating that he was relieved. However, as he leaned, he was confused about why they didn't chase the latter in that forest. The chain could be seen on the scene, and hearing the sound of the chain made him freeze. A big red eye appeared. Those teeth were larger than normal. It was a giant monster that had been sealed off for so long, and the day finally came to have some living food. The protagonist was shocked and screamed about that giant monster he was facing. He said that he came to the forest for a reason. The giant monster recorded the reason, possibly because Rujian sent the latter. It asked the latter if he was or not, then started to grab the protagonist using his hand, and he thought that Rujian was the Yunjian sect's ancestors, and could it be that the monster had some sort of relation with Rujian? The giant monster claw was about to hit him, and the latter screamed that Rujian had sent him. It made the giant monster stop and believe the latter, and stated that the old man Rujian was lying, and said that the giant monster would only be sealed for 100 years or so. And yet in those 100 years, Rujian didn't bother to visit him at all. The monster asked the latter if he just come to laugh at the monster. The protagonist is still scared and thinks about his ancestor, Rujian, who already understands the use of chains to imprison the giant monster. As the latter thought about his ancestor, the giant continued to ask him about helping. The giant was disconcerted because the old man wasn't there unless Rujian could not do anything anymore. It sniffed the latter and knew something about the soul power. The giant monster continues to ask since it looks confused and asks him if he was born with an innate soul root. Divided by the probability of an ordinary person processing a spirit root is quite high. The only difference was whether it was of good or poor quality. But soul root was something that not even geniuses or monsters might possess. Divided by the giant thought that the latter was a sick little guy in front of him was processed in soul root. The latter was lying on the ground as he looked at the giant monster about to attack him. The protagonist was confused about the sudden action of the giant monster and asked the latter if he didn't know that old guy Rujian had not told him before. Despite being scared, the latter answered yes to the question of the giant and said that it was the first time hearing of soul power or soul root or whatever. He didn't know a thing. The giant doesn't care and could not be bothered to care about that. The giant added that not only did that old man send the latter here and not tell him the reason, but he also possessed an innate soul root. The giant monster persuaded the protagonist since it was his case. Why don't the latter come and try? The giant will spare his life if he can pull the thing out. Xiaobai looked at the monster because of the sudden changing mood, let him pull something out, and thought about the monster talking about killing from the start. If he didn't pull it out, it might be killed immediately. He had to take the initiative to gain the upper hand, which was the only way to save himself. The protagonist turned his back to the giant and answered him by saying no, but it wasn't the answer that the giant was longing for. He then asks the giant one thing to kill him. Why should he help the giant? That makes the giant angry, and he suddenly throws a pit. He is about to grab the protagonist and scream that he will kill him today. Xiaobai was calming the giant for the sake of freedom. The giant should bear it, and the giant agrees that he wouldn't kill him, but if the latter can pull it out, he will reward him. The protagonist crosses their arms and says that he doesn't care about that, which makes the giant ask what he wants. The latter said that the giant should apologize to him and promised that he would not try to kill him, retarded that as if he wanted to apologize to the latter. Xiaobai was sincere about apologizing, and it didn't talk for a while. The giant decided and agreed and said that this venerable one would apologize to him. He also promised him that he would never kill him and bowed down. The protagonist was satisfied and fake coughing and asked the giant what he wanted to pull him out, which made the giant lower his head and pinpoint the pierced sword on his back. The latter asks if it is a sword. The giant explained that 100 years ago, the giant accidentally wandered and secretly and painstakingly managed to live, but his head was pierced by that thing. The giant searched for many people to pull out the sword, but no matter how high of cultivation level they were, they either perished or suffered severe injuries. Even for the latter ancestor, he had already tried it once, and his soul was almost destroyed. The latter was shocked about what he heard and said that it was ridiculous. The giant monster continued to explain that he was lured into the forest by the latter's ancestor and imprisoned by the chains until now. The giant was starting to growl in pain because his mind started to get influenced by the sword, and he told the latter that if he didn't act at that moment, it would be too late, and the giant would have swallowed him before he even pulled out the sword. The latter thought that he understood why his ancestor used chains to imprison this giant monster, and he must have been afraid that the giant monster would loosen his mind and kill mindlessly. He contemplated what other choice he had because there was none after all. No matter what he does, he will die, but at least by stepping forth, there was a chance that he might survive. The latter crawled up to the head of the giant monster and said that he didn't have any other choice, but Ancestor Rujian could not pull the sword out. He said it was not even possible for him to do it, and he complained that it was so high up there. The giant monster asked the latter if he could hurry up. The protagonist argued about trying his best to climb up. As the latter was finally in the head of a giant monster, the giant asked why he was not pulling it out. He shrugged and uttered to himself that he felt like he was about to drop dead and needed to rest. However, the giant shook its head and screamed to the latter that he should hurry up. The latter said not to move around and pulled out the sword. As he held the sword, the scene became purple, and the sword released a root and started embracing the hand of the protagonist. He knew that it was something bad. He thought that the black Kai had a mind of its own and was trying to devour spiritual Kai. He was shocked because his hand got stuck and could not let go. The latter screamed and pulled out the sword with all his might. He thought that it was no wonder Ancestor Rujian couldn't endure it. After he successfully pulled out the sword, it was the sword that debures people and made them lose consciousness and fall into the hands of the giant monsters. The giant monster was so amazed about the brat that he managed to fold out the sword. The giant thought that it was something that old monster Rujian could not do, too. It concluded that if the latter continued to grow, the humans would have another genius, and if that's the case, the giant would think about killing him at that moment because it would save him from all the trouble later on. As the monster kept looking at the protagonist, he saw the sword was slowly absorbed by the hands of the protagonist, making the giant eyes grow bigger and letting the protagonist rest. The giant sits down and keeps watching the latter to gain back his consciousness. After an hour, the protagonist came back to consciousness when the giant saw the letter shut down, leaned his back on the rock, and scratched his head. The giant made eye contact, and Xiaobai was scared and asked the giant why it was glaring at him. He was about to say something, then said that he forgot it because the giant monster wouldn't argue with him. The giant monster thought that he didn't have high hopes for that at first, but who would know? He then praised the protagonist because he managed to pull out the sword as he pointed his claw at the latter. That Xiaobai realized about the sword and asked where it went, and the giant bluntly said that the latter absorbed it. The protagonist froze at the moment and looked at his hand because he could not completely think that he had absorbed it. He thought that the dangerous thing had gone inside his body and then started swaying his hand to get rid of the sword. Meanwhile, the giant sees the letter's doings and thinks that he is an idiot, and continues to say that the letter won't be able to touch it because absorption can be categorized into two types, which are spirit absorption and solve absorption. The latter turned his back to the giant and listened as the giant continued explaining that for spirit absorption, the sword was located in the dantian, while for soul absorption, it was located in the muddy pellet, and he didn't have any spiritual power, so he should belong to the latter. Divided by muddy pellet is also known as the upper dantian. Divided by the giant continued that in the way of cultivation, people with spiritual roots were extremely rare. If his spiritual roots have attributes, then he will become the object of frenzy among major sects. Xiaobai asked if it was a good or bad thing that he absorbed the sword, and the giant monster answered that he was afraid that no one could give him an answer to this question, which made the protagonist wonder and ask the reason. The giant explained that the sword was eerie and had an unclear origin. It has troubled the venerable for 100 years. Whether or not it was a blessing or a curse to have absorbed it, he could only find out by himself. As the giant explained, the protagonist thought that it seemed that it did not answer anything at all and also thought that he had just escaped a disaster to end up in another mess again, and then sighed. When the protagonist remembered, he gazed at the giant and said that if he could pull the sword out, the giant would reward him. The giant was unhappy about the things that the latter uttered, and he avoided looking at the protagonist. The protagonist accused the monster of trying to run away. He said that the giant body was so majestic and extraordinary, the temperament was so novel, and surely would not deserve a little person like the protagonist. The giant answers him by saying that the venerable, naturally wonderful joke is like that and asking the letter to tell him what reward he wants. Xiaobai put his hand on his chin and thought the black sword inside his body must be taken out, but the demon had been suppressed for a long time, so he was not sure if he could do it. He had no choice but to put that matter aside first because there is still another important matter to deal with at the moment. By that, he remembered Yongcheng. If he returns now, the antagonist who was chasing him will not spare him lightly. He may even try to kill the latter if that is the case. He then decided and proceeded to ask the giant if the giant had a way to guarantee the latter's safety, and contemplated if it would be better if he could kill Yongcheng, since he knows that he is so low and other transmigrators can rule the world and have boundless power. On the contrary, he was being bullied by the bullies of the immortal sect. The giant monster was interested and asked if he heard that the letter wanted him to kill someone. The protagonist answered by saying he was a human scum because he was being bullied by him, and he was stronger than the protagonist, so he could not beat him. The latter seemed agitated as he put his fist up and clenched his teeth as he remembered the bad doings of Yongcheng. The giant monster was surprised and asked the latter as if the giant could not believe that the ancestor of the protagonist left him in a weakened state. Xiaobai was taken aback by what he heard and then said that he wanted to tell his ancestor Rujian. But after meeting the monster, he changed his mind. His eyes became darker, and the atmosphere got serious, and the giant asked him why. Xiaobai got mad and yelled at the monster and said that the giant still had the guts to ask why. If it were not for his unparalleled temperament and imposing presence, would he have come to you? And he put his hand on his waist and the other was pointing at the giant monster. The monster answered that, "Good kid. I didn't expect that the latter would have a sharp eye at such a young age." The hidden divine courage of the venerable had been seen through by him, and he agreed that he would help, but the latter would need to lure the person into the forest. And once that was done, he could leave everything to the giant monster. The latter said that luring the antagonist wouldn't be possible because he remembered that when he was running to the forest, Yongcheng chose not to chase after the protagonist, and that shows that he is aware of the place. He concluded that he knew the giant monster was in the forest and was afraid of him. As the latter was thinking about luring Yongcheng, the giant said that there was another possible way. The sky was blue on his way to the immortal sect residence. The servant who was opening the door of his room was exhausted from doing chores and sweeping the floor. His eyes were wide and shocked when he saw Xiaobai inside the room. The latter happily waved his hand and uttered the name of the servant. It was his brother Zhu. His brother ran quickly to the ladder and held both his shoulders, confirming that the protagonist was still alive. The protagonist answers him by saying that he is alive and kicking. However, brother Zhu is still flustered because he sees that the latter went inside the forest and wonders if he hasn't come across anything strange. The protagonist explained that he was so tired and painted shortly after entering. Then, he proceeded to ask his brother if he could tell him about Yongcheng's situation. He put his hand on his brother's shoulder with a grin on his face. Zhu was surprised and asked him what he was planning to do. He asked him if he would believe the protagonist wanted to kill Yongcheng. Brother Zhu froze at the moment and could not believe what he heard. He exclaimed that the latter should not speak recklessly because Yongcheng had a cousin behind him who was an official disciple of their Yun Jian sect. Neither the latter nor he could afford to offend him. If the latter had given the elixir and spirit stone at that time, he would have left him alone because he was also treated like that. But it wasn't expected of him. The protagonist retorted that his brother didn't expect him to take action against him, and his brother agreed. He then embraced his brother and wanted him to listen to him. However, his brother was not fully persuaded, and it was against his decision because it was way too dangerous. Despite the rejection, he continued to pursue his brother since they didn't have many resources. If the pupils they had were plundered once again, they would stay as menial workers for the rest of their lives, and others may have become accustomed to it. But he doesn't want that. Even if there was a glimmer of hope, he wanted to go on. Even the road was bumpy. Even if he will die, it was better than their present situation. He uttered the name of his brother and said that their destiny should not be controlled by others, so they would never stand out if Yongcheng was not eliminated. His brother was in a blank state of mind and asked if the latter could do it. Xiaobai affirms Zhu by answering yes. His brother is finally persuaded, and he would help the latter, stating that the protagonist should be prepared for the worst. For the protagonist, dying is not a big deal, and he will try to do his best not to implicate his brother. Zhu asked when they were going to execute the plan. The letter simply said that it will happen tomorrow. Outside the room, a group of people walked fast through the room. It was Yongcheng who seemed angry when he heard that Jiang Xiaobai had come back alive. As Yongcheng walked in front of the door, he was surprised when the door opened, and there it was, Xiaobai. He was conforming to the latter as if he were alive. By that, he commanded his servants to attack and beat the protagonist up. He kicked the protagonist in his belly while the other servants were throwing a fist at the protagonist. Yongcheng degraded the latter by insulting him, saying that he was not capable and that he just boasted one more time. Xiaobai's face was full of bruises, and the latter smiled and seemed satisfied. He then remembered that 2 hours ago, the giant monster had instructed the latter to stick his hand out and come closer as he put his claws and started to draw. The giant monster explains that he left a 5-spirit seal on his body during emergencies. He can use the seal to kill his opponent because his spirit is weak, and this power can only be used 5 times. The giant monster continued to explain that when the moment it was activated, it only needed 1 breath, but it could cripple anyone who was at the foundation stage or below. Xiaobai was amused by what he had learned at that moment, and he traced the symbol on his hand. He could not believe the power because it was huge, and it only took 1 breath. The giant also explains that his spirit seal has special after effects. On the outside, power would shock anyone, but on the inside, he just needed to stick his hand on the opponent's body, and it activated instantly. At that point, the power of the spirit seal would enter their body, which results in exploding their channels. Lastly, the opponent's body would explode in blood and eventually die if he thought the area would be way more exciting. The giant monster said to the latter that he had given the blade to kill others. It depended on whether he was brave enough to use it. The protagonist is confused about why he is not brave enough and then comes to the conclusion that if he treats his opponent lightly, he is treating himself cruelly, so he will not mind treating his enemies more cruelly. At present, Yang Cheng told him to listen, called him, and said that in the servants' courtyard, no one was brave enough to provoke him. There was no one before, and there is no one now and none in the future. He then questioned the protagonist, who does he think he was to disobey a young child, and then said that he must cripple the latter. While Xiaobai was on the floor that had dirt and provoked more, Yang Cheng uttered that when such an idiot like the antagonist became the owner, he didn't deserve it in front of the inner disciples. He used the servants to work even lower than dogs. As he continued, he said that ever since he could beat an inner disciple, he used them as servants to find the lost dignity. Yang Cheng was agitated and about to throw a punch and screamed that the latter sought death. When he almost punched the protagonist, someone stopped him and came from the sky, landing where he was standing as Yang Cheng's side eye. It was Huang Linyuan, and he thought that he was in close cultivation. That made Yang Cheng stop and say that whatever he stopped there for today, perhaps they could continue playing tomorrow, and he held the protagonist's hair with a grin on his face. He let go of the protagonist's hair and commanded the servant to leave and let go. When he was about to leave, Xiaobai grabbed his ankle, and Yang Cheng was surprised when he felt that someone was holding his ankle. The protagonist smiled and said that Yang Cheng was nothing special at all. The area became red, and Yang Cheng was destroyed, and his body was already gone. His servants were flabbergasted about what happened to their boss. Xiaobai was satisfied, and he lay flat on the ground. The servants were all scared and confused about the things that suddenly happened and why their boss exploded. The elder landed on the ground. He was the spirit-feeding ground. As the elder saw the blood, he thought that the protagonist had recently come as a new person. He couldn't have those methods, and there should have been someone attacking without others who were not the same. He also explained that strength was only at the 9th layer of the Kai refining stage. The opponent could unknowingly kill Yang Chen as, based on their strength, they are definitely above Elder Huang. As he continued thinking, could it be they already out the foundation stage rankings beyond the 9 layers of the Kai refining stage was the foundation stage even though the gap was only 1 layer, the difference was huge. The elder was shocked when he remembered the lady who had long white hair. He also thought the protagonist was sent by her to come here. Both of them most likely knew each other from the start and then sighed because he knew the personality of the lady. He then held Xiaobai and gave him a pill to recover. Later on, Elder Huang instructed that the incident must not spread, or else he wouldn't let the servants easily go. All the servants agreed on what he commanded. After the elder was about to leave, Chu was running and calling the name of Xiaobai, who was unconscious on the ground. He was taken aback when he saw the elder, and he instructed him to take care of Xiaobai. When the protagonist awakened, he needed to bring Xiaobai to the elder. Zhu agreed and turned to ask his co-servants about Yang Cheng and bluntly said he was dead, which made him freeze at that moment. He thought about the death of Yang Cheng and was amused that he did it. On the other hand, the area was all red with an eye and a sword in Xiaobai, who looked like floating at that moment. As the protagonist opened his eyes, he saw the sword and uttered it was the sword that was on the monster's head. He tried to reach it. However, as he kept trying, the sword pierced his body, and that made his eyes grow bigger, and he started to sit and scream about the sword. That's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you wish to have another part of this recap, please give us at least 2,000 likes. Please don't forget to comment and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Until next time.